and you're paying close attention, I'll be watching occasionally. There's champagne at the end of the session, so so you've all been.
Stick around.
Are you going to have some AI sort of pick out?
We're just watching
Pupil
the
dilation,
old-fashioned
so you know
way.
who's actually paying attention.
No, I'm fine. Okay. The school teacher way. I'm just going to keep an eye on who's awake through the. So my name is Kevin Delaney. I'm the co-founder and editor of Charter, and we're a future of work media and research company. You can find us at charterworks.com. And I have a great panel today. What we're focused on is the cost of digitalized childhood, specifically in the context of employers, the workplace, business consequences for that sort of lane of travel. I know there have been a lot of discussions about more focused on parents and education and other parts of this question. We've got a great panel here to talk about the business and employer side of things. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them, and I'm going to ask you each to just quickly tell us kind of what perspective you come at this from. So right next to me, there's Dr. Phil McCrae. He is an educator and scholar in the field of education, and you're Associate Coordinator for Research at the Alberta Teachers Association. Next to him, we have Jay Rosenzweig. He's the CEO of Rosenzweig & Company, which works in global talent management. Next to him, we have Rebecca Winthrop. She's the director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of a new book called The Disengaged Teen. You can hold it up if you want to.
You're the best moderator.
Okay, excellent. This is available as of last week. I think it's just out.
Kevin was at the book launch. This is why he knows so much about
great.
it.
And next to you, we have John Clifton. He's the CEO of Gallup, which, as everyone knows, is a firm that does a lot of pulse taking across workers and people generally about their success in the workplace and their well-being generally, which is very relevant to this question. So I'm going to ask, just before we dive into some of the issues, and maybe I'll start with you, Phil, just to give us like a 30-second, tell us how you're coming at this question.
Sure. So I come at from a K-12 education perspective, and the reason teachers teach is the future. So how do we help to foster an environment where young people can be successful citizens, engaged citizens, have an opportunity to meet not only their human potential, but also flourish in a world where automation, AI, and technology is changing every, it seems, 24 hours. So.
Great, thank you. Jay.
Yes, so I live a very active life. As you mentioned, I run a business in the talent strategy space. I'm the board chair of a human rights organization. I'm in the investment advisory space. I help founders scale up their businesses. So lots going on. And through that all, I focus a lot on having a very high level of energy because they say, someone with a high level of energy can accomplish in 1 year what others may take 10 years to accomplish. Therefore, if you live to 100, it's as if you've lived 1,000 years. So really focused on living a conscious life rather than a compulsive accidental life where you're accidentally happy when something good happens and the opposite of something that you don't want to have happen.
Do you have any tips for high level of energy for 4:30 p.m. panel 3 days into Davos?
Absolutely.
Okay. What's the secret?
Exercise.
Okay. Exercise.
Roman jet lag.
Exercise and understand that it's important to be joyful by one's very nature. And if you're joyful by your very nature, you'll have enough energy all the time to do whatever you need to do.
Okay. Excellent. Smiles out in the audience, and here we see for joyfulness. Rebecca, your perspective on this issue.
I now am Life Lessons by Jay. I'll come to your courses. I'm Rebecca Winthrop, and as Kevin said, I run the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. For those of you who don't know, it's a think tank in Washington, D.C. It's kind of like being a university professor, and policymakers and practitioners are your students. And for this panel, it's probably because I have been working on an initiative called Skills for a Changing World for the last 15 years, and most recently we have a global task force on AI in education, and I've just come out of 3 years of research, which Kevin, you so nicely gave a shout out to, with my colleague Jenny Anderson, really looking at student engagement in adolescence in particular, and motivation for learning, and how that intersects with technology. So
great.
That'll be my perspective today.
We'll come back to that. John, how do you explain your perspective on this issue?
Well, again, I'm John. I work at the Gallup organization, and George Gallup, at least in our minds, was one of the early pioneers in studying the emotional economy. And so about 20 years ago, we sought to put booster rockets on his vision to quantify the emotional economy in as many countries as possible. And so in about a third of the world, we do phone calls, but in another 100 countries, we show up at people's homes. And we ask them to tell us about their lives, how much stress they have, how much anger they have. I think one of the reasons that potentially Gallup was asked to participate is because we've seen concerning trends regarding people's well-being all over the planet. And this certainly may have to do with what's causing this dramatic crisis.
Okay, the digitalized childhood, we may tie that back. I want to start, I think we're going to take this conversation maybe in 3 parts, and the first is actually defining the problem. The second one is the impact that we're seeing on the workplace and might anticipate. And the third is how we're going to solve this, basically. And just to say that we're going to leave time for questions and comments and reactions. So we'll come to you all in a little bit. So I want to start with Jay, and we'll start with Phil and Rebecca on this question of, in terms of the digitalized childhood, and knowing that the context of this discussion is how we get to the workplace, what would you say are the specific harms, symptoms? What are the things that we should be concerned with that sort of carry through as young people eventually work their way to become employees?
Okay, both of us are like, not it, you go first. So one of the things that we're seeing in our research and in our global task force on AI in education, which is just beginning, so I wouldn't say this is the final word, is that young people are not given opportunity to develop agency over their own learning, and often over their own life. So this is US data. Adolescents have 10 times more rules they have to follow than an average adult, and 2 times more rules than an incarcerated fellow. And so agency is incredibly important, because you hear often employers saying they aren't taking it. My young employee, and I have a lot of I have 80 team members, so I have my own N to experience. Young people today, they're not taking initiative. You give them feedback, they're fragile, they melt down if something goes wrong. People are nodding. We run businesses over here, and it really starts with adolescent development, actually child development writ large. And there's the problem of not being given agency in school over their own learning. Less than 4%. Something we found in the research for the disengaged teen was less than 4% of kids regularly get to explore and have agency over their own learning in middle school and high school. And when you think about that, if you're not the author of your own life, if you're not able to make decisions, choices, you lose motivation, you disengage. And what is super distracting and way more fun? Screens, social media, video games, anything else. And there is a little bit of choice in that in some ways, but not that much. So that is, to me, one of the number one things that I worry about most. And I have another long list, but I want to pass over to Phil, and I can fill in after.
I think just before Phil, sorry. So this question of agency is partly parenting style, probably more micro-management parenting, and in the education system, it's a symptom of things like teaching to test and things like that. Is that fair?
So agency is literally the skill and the will to set a meaningful goal for yourself and pursue it, which includes the skill to ask for help. That is something that young people need when they go into the workforce, and they have to figure stuff out. And employers, and I say this as a boss of many young people, it's really annoying when they say, tell me exactly what I have to do it right. Like, that's very intensive, and it is also a symptom of something that we call achiever mode, which is high achieving kids are basically trying to get gold stars in everything that's put in front of them. And they're actually very fragile learners, and they ask questions all the time, but it's about how to get it right. They don't ask questions about following their own curiosity, figuring something out, which is sort of this other set of learning environments. And it's in school, and parents actually have a lot more influence than they think. You can compensate at home. But of course, the education system has a big role to play.
That's the core. Okay, thank you. Phil,
So I'm going to...
the harms of digitalized childhood that carry through to the workplace. Yeah.
Where does one start? Because there's a couple, first of all, I used to work in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates, and I'm going to apologize for all the things I don't say that you in the audience are like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? That's something that actually one of the sheikh had taught me when I worked there. So with those apologies in place, we have young people growing up in a world that is defined by an attention economy. So their devices are always trying to grab their attention. The constant pinging. In a classroom, on average, a student will have between a group of students, 30 students, will have between 600 and 800 pings in that class of 30 students, trying to get Snapchat or whatever it is attention. It's one of the reasons that in Alberta, we implemented a cell phone ban recently. We're 6 months into it because of that. So first of all, you know, they live in a world where there's an attention economy. So I think that's one implication of technology, which is also our own as adults. This isn't just young people. I think when it comes to this conversation of work and you know, life outside of the formal education system, one of the areas that I want to really focus on is resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity. Because for teachers, you want young people to learn how to learn into the future, but also be able to manage the randomness and, you know, challenges that we all inevitably face. So what we're seeing is a decline in that notion of resilience. And so we're looking at, yes, there's a mental health pandemic, you know, generally across society, but that lack of resilience is also coming from living 24/7 on screens, right? And some of the dynamics that are at play of a digitalized childhood. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. You know, young people being alone together, you know, and not actually having deep, meaningful relationships does not build resilience. Yet having meaningful relationships, or even, you know, meeting somebody for the first time and knowing, you know, like I met Jay recently, 15 minutes, 20 minutes ago, and I know we will have more conversations and, you know, learn about each other over time. But young people are being pulled by these technologies.
Can I just add one more to this list
Yeah,
before you move on? Because Phil brought it up, this idea of damaging sort of interpersonal relationships. We hear all the time from employers about Gen Z, Gen Alpha's interpersonal skills.
Yeah.
And you do need that in the workforce. You need to be able to work with a wide range of people. And for this research, for this book, we followed 100 kids in the US across 15 states over 3 years, not all of them over 3 years, but really got a deep look. And people often say, oh, they're connecting, they're connecting online. And there is a form of connection online. However, it does not really translate to person. So many kids would tell us, you know, I've been texting with my, you know, this girl I like or boy I like, and it's been 2 months. I see her in school every day, and we don't say anything to each other. What do I say to her when I see her in person? I mean, this is not uncommon.
Yeah.
So developing relationships online, whether it's text, FaceTime, Snapchat, video games, whatever, there is a social component, but it does not transfer. And so to think that they can just spend all their time online and then show up in the workforce and be fully formed social beings doesn't work.
Yeah. John, I want to pull you in. And I know Gallup tracks a lot of indicators of individual thriving, basically. Are there any indicators of youth well-being that relate to this question of tech usage that you're seeing show up in your surveys?
Well, I think one of the most concerning trends that we've seen, many of you are probably familiar with the World Happiness Report. That's actually Gallup that produces that information. We simply ask people, rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 is the best possible life, 0 is the worst. Where do you stand today? And really remarkable research, originally done at Brookings, thank you for that, which showed that there is a U-curve of happiness. Many of you are probably familiar with it. When you're young, you rate your life very high. As you continue to age, you start to rate your life lower, but then as you continue to get older, you rate your life a lot higher, which makes a U. In fact, some suggest that the graph is actually smiling at you, hence the U curve of happiness. But something that happened very recently that's interesting is the U curve bent. And actually where young people were rating their lives in a very high way has now gone down. And the next question is, of course, so what happened? And we think there are a number of causes to it, one being loneliness. Loneliness is something that is debilitating for human beings. There's research now by Juliana Luntz-Holt who says that loneliness will increase your chances of dying by 50% of anything. So this is really concerning. The second piece is financial well-being. We see that concerns, at least in the United States, that there are a lot of young people that are suffering financially. And then the last one, again, these are really hard things for us to put a finger on, but you can see other data that support it outside of Gallup's data, like at UCLA. But suddenly we saw a massive collapse in young people feeling like they have an attachment to a purpose. And that's really concerning. I mean, there are philosophers that have been telling us for 2,000 years the importance of having purpose in one's life. And as soon as that becomes absent for a generation, it's not great. So we think that those might be three things. Of course, sometimes our analysis can be limited to what we've researched and what we can draw from our crosstabs. So there may be many other things, but those are three worth heavy consideration.
John, have you made a connection between any of them and increased technology usage? So loneliness sort of lines up with some of the things that Rebecca and Phil have been talking about. Is it possible in your data to draw a clear line, or is that still emerging?
Well, if there's one that I can't help but wonder about, which is decline in purpose.
Yeah.
There was a study, this wasn't Gallup's, but for whatever reason, when people are on social media, their financial well-being or how they feel about their own money declines. If we were robots, how much money we make, somebody shouldn't be able to influence us on whether or not that amount of money is a lot or a little. And yet social media makes us all feel smaller about how much we make. And a lot of times money is some people's way, or some approximations, not all, because of course there are many professions that may not have high pay. But again, maybe it's too rough of a proxy, but there could be something there about purpose. And the only reason I bring that one up is because I think a lot of us make an obvious connection around social well-being, and I think that's right. But I do think that a lot of these technological advancements are going to have us questioning some of these very paradigms about what is loneliness. Because, take the Turing test on what is artificial intelligence. If you feel like that's a friend and you don't feel lonely, then are you lonely? And I don't know what the answer is. I don't think any of us can quite answer that yet today. But again, it's why I think just so that we be careful and attribute too much to technology to certain things, and there might be other places like purpose where it could be having a troubling effect.
And the financial factor which you cited actually does make sense because of the culture and visibility of consumption on social media. So you might feel worse about your own because you don't have the expensive clothes that you might see people. So that kind of tracks. And then Rebecca and then Jay.
I know Jay needs to come in, but I just wanted to say to John's point about purpose, we found that in young people, that there was kind of this toxic brew of academic intensity and kids seeing through social media, through tech, how the world is changing and feeling like what they're doing in school is irrelevant. It's not preparing them. The gap has become a chasm. And basically saying to themselves, I am stuck, I can't opt out, I have to do this, everyone in my life is telling me I have to try really hard and do really well in order to have a good life, and feeling like that isn't a purpose in and of itself. That somehow education is no longer, it's sort of empty for a lot of kids who are doing well. So I think that there might be a connection there.
And just before I go to Jay, I want to pull you in on this, but John, one quick follow-up. You said the U curve was bending for young people in terms of their happiness. When did you start seeing that? How recent is that?
This previous report that came out, they aggregate 3 years of data, and they just spotted it now.
Okay, great, thank you. Jay,
Yeah.
in terms of the harms of digitalized childhood that track through to the workplace, what are you following specifically?
Well, I agree completely with Rebecca that nurturing of children is key.
Yeah.
Is key. I think parenting obviously can play a very big role in the self-esteem of a child, so that of course there are certain tactical things that can be employed, like ensuring even in the workplace that there are times when digital and technologies are loose, things of that nature, but we can shield children from social media, we can shield children completely from technology, etc. But I think that the very best way to shield a human being from early days is to nurture their self-esteem.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very big thing. I also think that it's kind of ironic, study after study has shown that we're either in a loneliness pandemic or on the verge of one. And the irony of it to me is that you can actually be stimulated 24 hours a day in this day and age. And paradoxically, this loneliness is so pervasive. So I recall my own childhood where, there were times throughout the day where there was boredom.
Yeah.
And I think the lack of boredom is a problem, because boredom stimulates energy, the energy to be creative, the energy to figure out out of thin air a game that you play with a friend. And boredom also, if nurtured properly, fosters stillness. And the ability to be still and to be with oneself without stimulation, I think is a way to develop resilience as well, which is very valuable moving forward. So today, it's the opposite. One needs to actually exert tons of energy, and I think we need to foster that among young people. Tons of energy to actually get away from all the stimulation. So it's almost as if a new species of human being is emerging, and it's very important to be cognizant of that.
I think that's the best case for boredom that I've ever heard, the way you just put it. I want to go to how this is actually showing up in the workplace and what employers can do. Before I do, I'd like to just spend 1 minute on AI, and so some of the AI applications, and in particular, it seems like, Rebecca, to start with you, and then maybe Phil to fill in after. This question of agency would seem to, there are questions of sort of cognitive handoff where you're not actually necessarily learning things because you're just offloading that to the AI. Do you see any specific amplification or concern about the digitalized childhood and the issues we've started talking about in the context of AI?
So there's certainly going to be times when AI is really helpful in education writ large. Maximizing efficiency of busing schedules, maximizing sort of scheduling and calendaring, like a lot of back of the office admin that adults use AI for. But when it comes to interacting, AI, putting Gen AI into, or predictive AI, into the teaching and learning process with children who are developing their competencies, it is a really dicey game. And I think my main message to everybody is we literally don't know from a child development standpoint. And I gave this analogy on a previous panel, but it would be like if a shoe company said, oh my gosh, I invented these magic shoes. Your baby doesn't have to learn to crawl. They can just shoot right to walking. It'll be great. Just put them on and off you go. Crawling has a developmental purpose.
Yeah.
It is spatial awareness, it is critical thinking, it literally wires the left and right brain hemispheres together. You need to crawl to do other things besides walk. So we literally don't know what are those things that kids have to do on their own when it comes to learning that we shouldn't hand off to Gen AI. And so I'm extremely worried about the illusion of effortless learning. Phil and I talk about this a lot, where there is use cases where adaptive learning, personalized learning, if it's done in small amounts to really fill gaps, particularly in marginalized communities, can be quite effective. But if you're going to unleash Gen AI and have kids just have their learning process be a steady drip of spoon-fed adaptive learning software, how are kids going to learn to figure things out on their own? So that's a huge risk, and there's many more, but I will stop and let Phil handle.
The magic shoes is a great analogy. Phil?
So I'll maybe point to some research. We've been doing a scoping project on artificial intelligence for about 8 years to try and get an understanding. It's changing rapidly, but from its earliest evolution to now, trying to understand what are the big issues in relation to young people in education and so on. And there's 3 that we're looking at. One of them is cognitive atrophy. So this idea of losing some skills or skill sets, critical thinking maybe is one of them, to or saving stillness actually, which I really appreciate. You know, those. What are the things that we're atrophying, what we're maybe struggling with this new generative AI world? The second is trust. With AI-generated misinformation, disinformation, you know, this notion of trust. One of the really interesting things in K-12 education, and I believe in post-secondary as well, where I'm a professor at the University of Alberta as well, is this idea of, you know, did you write this, did you not write this? The whole concept of plagiarism. And what does that mean? And how do you use artificial intelligence in your writing, maybe as an editor, auditor, and, you know, what are the affordances as well as the challenges? So there's this issue of trust, broadly writ. And the third, and for me probably the most important, is something called moral passivity. And that's giving up the decision making to an algorithm. And when I say this isn't an imaginary. I've been in rooms where people have said, if we have enough data on a child, we can use predictive analytics out of the artificial intelligence system to make determinations on their future. And that's a huge problem for somebody who's been in education for 33 years, because our whole purpose is to believe in human potential, to be hope-filled for them and with them, and to do whatever we can to move them forward, right? It doesn't have to be everybody in an academic, but to really believe in a young person, or, you know, even in university, an older person, to support their life trajectory. So moral passivity, cognitive atrophy, and issues in relation to trust are 3 that our scoping project right now in Canada is starting to pull out.
As an employer, that sounds really great to have employees who are coming to the workforce with cognitive atrophy, trust issues, and passivity.
And no agency.
And no agency, and they're very little resilience. And
okay, now just saying this, I have to say this because I have 700,000 students that ultimately I have to speak to. There are some amazing young people all over the world who are doing great things. Sometimes, you know, it is this peak pessimism, I think is the phrase that's been used. But one of my superpowers is to be eternally optimistic. So while those happen, we do have some amazing young people who are going to define a wonderful, hopeful future as well. So,
well, we're optimistic because we're scheduled to solve the problem by the end of the hour.
Excellent.
So,
good. Easy.
So I want to shift us now to specifically the situation of the employer and talk a little bit. And Jay, I'm going to start with you, and then John, how we're seeing some of these things show up in the workplace, or how we anticipate them showing up in the workplace, and then later we'll go to some of the fixes for some of the stuff.
I think, well, first of all, to Phil's point, the young generation is one that I feel very optimistic about as well.
Yeah.
The young generation is, I think, very hungry for great experiences and having real impact. I find it's all a generalization, but I find that young people are less materialistic in a lot of ways, less interested in things and more interested, as I say, in having great experiences. So I think employers need to understand that.
Put it another way, they're less capitalist often.
Well, you could be both.
Yeah.
You could be both, and I mean, one of the things that I focus on, even in my own career, is the intersection of profit and purpose,
Yeah.
and presenting opportunities for young people to really make a massive impact. And sometimes it's actually more effective to go out and make a major impact when there's money on the line.
Yeah.
But it really does go back to early childhood nurturing, so that we can have young people who are resilient, are not overly defensive, and actually thrive on positive feedback. And one of the things that I would say is there's maybe not enough of an emphasis on two things which I think foster those things, and that is physical activity, as I was talking about earlier, whether it's sports or dancing or whatever. I think a really good cure for most individuals suffering is physical activity, and secondly, music. Taking up an instrument, listening to music, somehow being involved in music. I think those two things are hugely important and often downplayed as kind of secondary bonus kind of activities to be involved in. But those are just two examples of ways one can foster more well-rounded, peaceful human beings.
Great. John, in terms of how this is manifesting itself in the workplace, or you anticipate it playing out, some of the consequences of what we've been talking about, what do you see?
Well, Rebecca said something that was kind of interesting about achievers, because I've wondered something very similar. And also this disconnect, because you have such a large percentage of young people that are saying, I don't feel ready for the workplace. And by the way, they're not alone, because if you ask employers also say, I don't think they're ready for the workplace. So what's the disconnect? And I was really inspired. I think one of the best thought leaders right now in higher education is Chancellor Dondi Plowman at the University of Tennessee, because I think she's doing some really fascinating things. And one thing that she did is, this is back when she was the dean at the University of Nebraska Business School, but she took this assessment to do analytics. I don't know if any of you are familiar with StrengthsFinder. It's a talent finder. It's something that Gallup does, but she administered it for all the faculty. And then she administered it for all the students. And what she found is that all the faculty had one thing in common. They all had learning. And then she looked at what the students had. They all had competition. What she discovered was the faculty were designing curriculum for themselves, not for the students. But we know that there are thousands of ways to learn. And so when we talk about some of the threats of AI, one of the great opportunities is, can we now scale individualized learning so that students can now learn in their own unique ways in how they see the world. If for some reason you don't have learner in your top 5, I don't, and you show up to an institution, maybe it doesn't have to feel so awkward anymore, and you can learn in a way that's unique to you. By the way, Villanova University is implementing this, and it's really fascinating. So they look at the frequencies, the talent frequencies of the students in a classroom, and what they do is they say if they have achiever in their top 5, they actually play into that strength, and they say give them more opportunities for extra credit. But if they have context in their top 5, give them more case studies, because that's how they love to learn. So again, I think one of the ways to do this, how do we address this? I know I'm skipping ahead because you said that. Maybe an inspiration from what Chancellor Plowman originally did would be to scale individualized learning. And I think we'll have a lot of students that are a lot more ready than they ever have been for the workplace.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we'll come back to that and maybe just stay for a minute on this question of how some of the digitalized childhood, some of the harms we're starting to see show up in workplaces. Rebecca, do you want to?
Well, we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things that my mind immediately goes to is something that you talk about, which is, I believe the stat is 60% of employees are disengaged at work.
Yeah.
And we found in our research that it's about that same percentage who are disengaged at school. Surprise, surprise. So to me, you know, we can come back to this to solutions. Kevin, I know everyone's skipping forward, but how engaged you are really, how motivated and engaged you are in what you're doing. And we've been circling around this. It's around purpose, it's around energy, you know, it's around resilience. But how motivated and engaged you are in whatever you're doing is a huge driver in your interest, your attention, your resilience, your creativity. And so I really think people think about employee engagement, they also think about student engagement as sort of the nice to have, like the cherry on the top of the ice cream sundae, and I think it's really like the ice cream. I think that it's the center piece, and they're connected. Young people and workforce.
Because you're the same person when
you don't you know, you don't graduate secondary school and all of a sudden you know, in 24 hours become a totally engaged, dynamic, you know, energized, self-actualized human being.
The other part you talked about engagement, resilience. The other thing that I've seen correlated with performance or well-being is, and maybe it's a side effect, but is a sense of optimism. So if you ask people, do you believe in 5 years you and your family will be better off than you were now? If someone answers yes to that, they're much more likely to be resilient and engaged and so forth. And among the troubling things are that the results of that correlate pretty directly with income level. So if you are making more money, you're more likely to be optimistic. If you're not making money, it's sort of obvious. It's less optimistic. John, did you want to add to that? No.
The other thing,
retweet, because that's a lot of what Gallup says. So yes,
okay. I probably absorbed it from your research.
The other thing that's highly correlated for young people is identity, a sense of self, a sense of identity. Much less likely to say, I go along with whatever anybody around me does. Much less likely to say I don't have my own values or opinions about what I should do with my life. So which is very important.
Great. So
I'm going to say something very teachery. So when we look at learning and how people learn, well, I agree that the ability to engage with something and some of the possibilities of picking up and learning all kinds of interesting things, AI will help us with that. The most complex problems that we're going to face in the world going forward, or in workplaces, those challenges need to be socially constructed and through a collaborative learning process. I really believe that there's been a promise of individualized learning for a long time. And I remember years ago, I was at a senior level meeting in a government meeting, and somebody had said, learning, all we have to do is deliver it. We just deliver learning, right? Put the curriculum in a box, and you just sit in front of a screen and you can learn, right? That was kind of the imagination that was presented a decade ago. And learning isn't like delivering a pizza. You don't deliver learning. Learning is part of a discovery process. It's part of a constructed. It's like, oh, well, you have a different perspective there. No, you have, it's Vygotsky and social constructivist theory is what we know about learning, right? So there's that background. I think that's going to be increasingly important for the most complex problems we face, because we are going to need the most diverse approaches to these complex problems possible. I often say diversity is the source of a system's intelligence, and you can't get that diversity just from a hyper-personalized algorithm. You actually need to hear from different people and perspectives, and throw in a little bit of randomness and serendipity into that to have a challenge that helps you think through what those really complex future problems we are all going to face. So I look at the challenges for the workforce and so on, and I think about what can an individual bring to a collective group, to a community, because we never live in isolation, right? So how do we get people to learn about the art of conversation? right? I mean, we're getting into like, what are some of the solutions, which I don't want to go too far,
We're
but
about to go there.
yeah. Okay, so I'll let you take us where we're going to go.
So just to say that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to open it up for questions or reactions in just a few minutes. Now we're going to shift here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
But what? So I think you and I are completely aligned, actually, and
Yeah.
my intent was not to convey that individualized means that it should be done in isolation.
Yeah.
And I think, it's remarkable. Anthropic was here earlier, and many of us know that they are working to decode their LLM, to understand how it works.
Yeah.
Yet, despite all our best efforts, we haven't quite decoded the human algorithm yet. Because if we did do that, we would have a much better understanding about how each individual works. And so I guess my question would be, what is it that creates a thriving team? What do you do to create chemistry? What is the thing that actually causes one's ability to work in a team better? And the one thing I would say is, just because we've done research on it, it's when they get to know each other. And this is research that even the Department of Transportation looked at 40 years ago. It's called CRM. It's not to be confused with the CRM to manage pipelines in a business context. Crew Resource Management. And what they did is they were looking at a test among airplane crews because they were studying fatigue. And they wanted to know, what could we do to combat fatigue? And so all of a sudden they figured out, combat mistakes when crews are fatigued. And what they found, again, 40 years ago, is there were some groups that were tired, and they made less mistakes than those that were fresh. And what they found, they didn't even mean to, what they found is it were the teams that knew each other, that had chemistry. And the only way to make that chemistry really flourish, and again, this is just some of the data that we've looked at, is that they know each other's uniquenesses. And so again, when I say individualize, it's not to say let's further isolate. It's decode each other's human algorithms so that we can flourish in an academic ecosystem, but also to be able to flourish in teams.
And that lines up with the idea of psychological safety being the key factor. It's the same thing of the performance of teams, Project Aristotle, Google.
One of the most contentious things Gallup has ever asked in our 90-year history is whether or not people at work have a best friend.
Yeah. Good question.
If you want to infuriate executives or anything like that, walk in and say, do you want to see the data on what % of a best friend at work? Because everyone...
What are the reactions?
Not great. They think that best friends are something that has no business within the workplace, that what we care about, and understandably so, productivity, but what we care about is how our customers are doing, making sure that we're addressing the bottom line, making sure that we're innovating. But to your point, I mean, psychological safety, some of the things that Amy Edmondson has done in the past, she was ultimately talking about where can you go in a safe space to be like, I have a question and I'm kind of afraid to ask somebody, where can I find this particular resource, and can I bounce some ideas off you? And so there are some challenges with the workplace today, because building friendships is not unlike school. When we were forced to come in, we made friendships for life. And some of those could be challenged in remote or hybrid structures. So we need to make sure that we maintain those, not just because it's good for business, but because it's also good for a human being's soul.
So now we want to shift fully to this question of solutions, what employers can do specifically. I think there are probably 3 levels. So one is as a manager, how do you have the workforce coming in? How do you manage differently to react to that, to accommodate it, to support it? The second level maybe is influence over habits in terms of your own, the equivalent of your cell phone or your phone ban in school. What is the employer equivalent? And the third is probably the influence of employers over policy and the tech industry among others. So Jay, I'm gonna let all of you sort of take those 3 altitudes as you want, but maybe you could start us off. What are the things employers can do to support these generations?
There's a number of different tactics that can be used. I think offering programs under the umbrella of wellness would be important. So I'm involved in some venture capital funds that have full-time executive coaches. There's a business that has done incredibly well in Toronto. It's like at 4 billion or something right now. They brought on a psychiatrist and a psychologist who is available 24/7 to meet any of the employees from president on down on a confidential basis, and I can tell you she's quite busy because the venture world, the early stage, high growth world is a very, very difficult and stressful one.
Yeah.
You can have tactical programs like certain pockets of the day where it's no tech zone. I think off-site activities, particularly if it's nature-oriented, physical activity-oriented, nothing that would shame anybody, but enough that it fosters getting to know one another. Those sorts of things I think are really important. But I want to just make one broader point, which I've been thinking about throughout this discussion. I think the notion of success is one that has been distorted in a lot of ways. From day one, children are asked, what did you get? What mark did you get in school? How did your friends do by comparison? This notion of success, at least in North America where I live, relates to really being one up on someone else, comparatively speaking. Whether it be a nicer car than your neighbor, a nicer house. I went on a better trip than that person went on. It translates into social media as well, which you alluded to as well. I think that it's important, from my point of view, to look at success as trying to be the most full-fledged human being you could possibly be. And that doesn't mean being lax, quite the opposite. It means being intense, but being on the path to being the most full-fledged human being you could possibly be, like every other species. The mango tree aspires to be the very best mango tree it could possibly be. The caterpillar tries to be the best caterpillar it could possibly be. And each of us as human beings, I think, should be striving for that. So success in a lot of ways to me is if you're grounded in that kind of state of being joyful by nature, as I started, anything that comes at you, you know how to be. You know how to surf the waves up and down and enjoy this adventure we call life. I think that's the way we should be doing success.
Yeah.
And that fosters happy and productive employees as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned the availability of mental health resources, psychologists, psychiatrists to venture. I think it's AT&T has done that. They made their therapists available to all of their staff, and they're completely oversubscribed. When you put those resources into a workplace, they definitely don't provide them.
And I would include, there's resource constraints too, which companies have, but I would ideally include mindfulness workshops, yoga, meditation, things of that nature.
Yeah. Phil, so things that employers can do on these different levels, manager, kind of influence over behaviors, and then in terms of policy.
So I'll talk from cradle to grave. I'll talk about actually not just employers, but the whole life cycle. I love what Gallup is doing around do you have a best friend? Because when I talk to early career teachers, beginning teachers, and I just did a keynote for many of them in Alberta, I say you need to find a bestie down the hall. And what I mean about that, to build that resilience, is that they feel they belong. There's a sense of belonging, which I think is really important in the workplace. Because that sense of belonging leads to their ability to be creative, to move forward. So I think that's important. But underlying all of that, and when I say, from kind of cradle, from what we can do in the education system into the workplace, is to really foster and support the art of conversation. How do you get people to be able to break bread with each other, talk to each other, look each other in the eye, and have like a social emotional dynamic? When we look at the big bottlenecks to artificial intelligence, things that will not be displaced right away, social emotional intelligence, that sense of empathy, being able to read that, is one. creativity is the second, right? And third is actually fine motor is one of the other big bottlenecks. But trying to foster a sense of belonging through conversation, social emotional understanding, empathy, I think is really important all throughout life, so that you're able to essentially read the room and know what's going on.
That's interesting. It makes me think about family dinners as like one of the ways that parents can do that.
Which actually in our work with parents, we say don't bring devices out during dinner or bedtime, because those, we know first of all around dinner time, it's one of the greatest spaces to protect young people to be able to have that conversation. And then nocturnal screen time is a huge challenge that we've been pushing on.
My kids would laugh. Like my number one rule is no phones at dinner.
It's a great model too.
And I model it too. If I'm in a meeting with you, having a lunch meeting, I'll never have my phone out.
Right. So your kids are on the table. Rebecca, what can employers do? And then John.
So as I'm listening to everybody talk, I just see so many through lines between engaged, motivated kids in school and engaged, motivated employees in the workforce. Yeah. So one of the big reasons why kids check out is lack of belonging. So this idea of asking for, do you have a best friend at work? It's very similar to, do you feel like you belong at school? Another big reason kids check out is lack of relevance. So feeling like what they're doing has no purpose or meaning, again, similar. And so to me, I really just keep thinking about how can we prioritize engagement at school and at work as a through line. And I think people get off on the wrong foot when in classrooms they think engagement is like jelly beans, rainbows, sunshine, like points, party hats. And at work, like let's have a really big company party and then everybody will be happy. That's not how you build engagement and motivation. It's in the doing of it. And so one of the things that we found in our research for the book, The Disengaged Teen, was that there was 4 different ways adolescents engage in their learning. And I think it applies to young people at work.
Okay.
Passenger mode, coasting, doing the bare minimum, trying to do a shortcut. It's the quiet quitters, and frankly, teenagers are the pioneers of quiet quitting. And that is actually about 50% of middle school and high school kids say they're kind of in passenger mode. And engagement is how you learn, not necessarily what you learn. And the grades only tell 50% of the story. You could be getting great grades and be in passenger mode because school's too easy for you. We already talked about it, achiever mode. This is where kids are doing their best, trying very hard to be perfect, not just be excellent, be perfect, which no one can be, at everything that's put in front of them. They end up being very fragile learners, being incredibly busy, and a lot of it has to do with competition. We've talked about competition, social media, and social comparisons, and social media exacerbates competition. And those kids end up being very fragile learners, and kids in competitive schools have some of the worst mental health outcomes of all kids. Then you've got kids in resistor mode. They are pissed off. They are, and we're talking about young people, so they're using their behaviors, their voice, probably inappropriately, but they have some agency and some gumption, and they're saying, this isn't working for me. They don't do their homework, they're class clowns, they skip school. There's a whole bunch of kids around the world dealing with school refusal. It can be very serious. But those are the kids we think of as disengaged. The others kind of coast by, we don't think of. And really what I think we need to do in school and in the workplace, and I would love to turn to John and Jay to be like, what would this mean in the workplace, is get kids into explorer mode. That is where they are, they're showing up, they're cognitively engaged, they're emotionally engaged, they feel they belong, they're interested, and they are agentically engaged. They're taking initiative over what they can do. They're following their curiosity, they're suggesting ideas, they're being given a little bit of choice, and it trains them to be the employees we want. Yeah. So how do you get them into explorer mode in the workplace?
We're gonna go to John, and we're actually gonna come to questions very quickly. Just one thing, as you were talking, I was thinking I interviewed Bob Putnam recently. He's the guy who wrote Bowling Alone, and his answer, as we know, like for the last few decades,
Social capital.
has been the work softball team. It's the way that you cultivate trust, belonging, empathy, and in the context of workplaces, particularly in polarized workplaces, because of political division and other factors, that's his answer. And maybe it's a pickleball team now, but he's still focused on softball teams.
The one thing that I do want to say about Explorer Mode, before you guys come to this, is that the kids who are in Explorer Mode in school get the best grades in the school. There have been in-class comparisons.
Yeah.
Are the happiest, have the best mental health outcomes, and they're actually developing the agency to navigate a world of AI. So we really, really want them to spend as much time as possible there.
Great. John, you can round us out on this question of what employers can do on these different levels, and then we're going to open it up for some questions.
Well, just to put a fine point on what Phil said, that, you know, this idea of best friend at work, you know, the military, or at least the US military, had figured it out many years ago, which is you join for country, but you fight for your brothers and sisters. And there's something similar. There's based on Gallup data a long time ago, it said you join a company, but you leave because of your manager. But you could also say you join a company, but you stay because of your colleagues. And for whatever reason, there are a lot of executives who don't fundamentally appreciate that. And I think it's because we've largely had this blind spot to what we call the emotional economy. And they're completely focused on the rational economy. And you know, there are some estimates we've determined that our decisions, 30% of them, are based on rational thought, 70% on emotional thought. There are others that say, no, Gallup, actually you're wrong. Yuval Noah Harari said in his book, I think it was Nexus, he said actually it's 99.9% are emotional, not rational. And so this is why I think, you know, the very practice of management hasn't necessarily evolved to fully appreciate this. And while EAP, employee assistance programs, are critical, even employees, the World Union Group actually came out and said, employers, please stop, because you're making it like we're the problem, when actually the problem is the broken workplace. And I'll give you an example of what it means to be a broken workplace with respect to the emotional economy. One question that we ask all over the world is the following: do you agree or disagree with this statement? I know what is expected of me at work. Guess what percent can't fully agree to that particular item? Half. 50% of people around the world go, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. Imagine that. And then your manager comes back to you and says, that's not what I asked. And you're like, pretty sure it is. I have it in writing. But that, you know, from all of this psychosocial analysis that we've done previously, this is what causes the unnecessary stress and anxiety that exists in workplaces today. And it's why when you just overlay engaged, not engaged, and actively disengaged with anger, stress, sadness, pain, and worry, you increase negative emotions by 50% when you don't have this emotional economy figured out. And so until we get that buttoned up, I don't know how many, you know, EAP type programs that we can put together to really address negative emotions in the workplace.
Great, the emotional economy. So we're going to go to questions now. And the first question, I think, is Margarita in the back. Yep.
In reality, I have less question, but just 3 comments.
Yep.
The first, before I forget,